Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very good afternoon to you. Welcome to our episode 5 of our Business Rebound webinar at the Nelson Mandela University Business School. We are very glad to have you here. Our speaker today is Prof. Gerd Schwandner of Germany. We are very glad to have Gerd here today. Gerd is the former mayor of the city of Oldenburg in Germany, so he's got a lot of experience in building cities and how to really, manage enterprises and small businesses and grow these businesses in cities. Very important to have a person like that at this time in South Africa. But Gerd is also a professor of international management and marketing strategies at Karlsruhe University of Applied Sciences in Germany. So he's also international manager, international management professor. Gerd lectured at various universities. He lectured at Hong Kong Baptist University, Shanghai Normal University, Beijing International Studies University. Gerd also lectured at University Robert Schuman in Strasbourg, France, and various Italian universities as well. So Gerd is a very lectured, very globalized lecturer in our midst today here. And very importantly also for us, Gerd is also an expert in executive education, because he lectured also at the Harvard Business School on the executive education programs at Harvard. Now, I don't want to steal Gerd's thunder, and I don't want to steal his time. We only have 1 hour, because we're very glad to have a person of the caliber of Gerd amongst us today. So please, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Gerd. And we're going to waste more time, and because we want to listen to Gerd speaking to us on international affairs. His topic today is how is COVID-19 influencing geopolitics and international business and trade? How is COVID-19 influencing geopolitics and international business and trade? Gerd, welcome. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Cecil, for this wonderful introduction. You already set the bar very, very high for my lecture. I've prepared a PowerPoint presentation, as I usually do. I did it in February this year at Nelson Mandela Business School as well, and hopefully I can provide some insights on what's going on in the world. I try to start with my presentation. So I hope everybody can see it. That's the opening chart. That's correct?
Yes, Gerd, we can see you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. This is my agenda for the afternoon. I have 4 parts. I would start with the COVID-19 pandemic as of today. The second part is geopolitics, especially the US-China conflict, which will be or is the paramount conflict of the world for the years to come. Maybe a little fantasy about the scenarios of the outcome. Part 3 is trade and businesses, and I would like to have tourism as a poster child for business to exemplify some of the arguments I'm having. We'll try to talk a little bit on the issue of recovery of businesses, which is pretty difficult to judge at the moment. And part 4 would be the impact on Africa. And hopefully we have a couple of minutes left for Q&A. Okay, let's start with the first part, the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see at the bottom of my slide a quote by Kishore Mahbubani in his article in The Economist from April 20 this year. You might not be familiar with Kishore Mahbubani. He is the former ambassador of Singapore to the United Nations, and he is also an intellectual with a huge followership in Asian countries, and he is often very critical on the Western approach, how politics is done. And he said that the crisis, the pandemic crisis, highlights the contrast between the competent responses of East Asian governments, especially from his point of view, China, South Korea, and Singapore. That was before Singapore figured out that they simply have forgotten to check the dormitories for the workers from Bangladesh, Malaysia, and other countries, and the incompetent responses of Western governments, such as, and he named Italy, Spain, France, Britain, and the United States in particular. So at the beginning of this year, at a very, very early stage, you could see at the lower left the first numbers of cases in the world, mostly in Asian countries and in Australia and a little bit of Europe. And the death rate, the fatality rate was very low at that point. It was 2%. If you compare COVID-19 with Ebola, for example, if you look to the lower right, you can see that this virus is much more deadlier than COVID-19. This is the situation from this morning worldwide, and you can see that it's really a pandemic. More or less every country in the world is really suffering from that, with a few exceptions, maybe this part of Africa where you simply have no data, and this is Victoria Lake and not a country. If you look at Africa in particular, you can see that the country which is suffering the most by far is South Africa. South Africa these days is already the fourth country in the world which was most suffering from COVID-19. Number one, that's America first, is the United States, then it's Brazil. You can see if you check Europe, it's relatively homogeneous in the center of Europe with the exception of Spain. Even Italy is a little bit better than Spain. So why I'm talking about COVID-19, I'm not talking about the virus in general. I would like to point out the political aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the blame game, so to speak. You're all familiar with the Kung Flu term, which Trump has coined to blame China for the pandemic of the world. And this corresponds pretty much, if you see the chart on the right side from the Pew Research Center, and they just recently did a survey midst of July, how the view of US citizens of China is favorable or unfavorable. And you can really see that it's an all-time high of an unfavorable view of China. So this will have an impact on the next election in the United States and maybe on some other political issues as well. If you remember at the beginning, there was pretty much what I would call xenophobia, not only in the US, but also in many European countries, where if you have had an Asian face, you have been blamed on the street from people just looking at you, that you are a virus, so to speak. This is French, by the way, je ne suis pas un virus, un virus, where an Asian-looking guy is saying, I'm a man and not a virus. So how did the governments react when they have been facing the pandemic? And this is a chart from The Economist from June 20 this year. And if you look at Asia and Oceania, you can see that Chinese citizens are pretty much happy with her government, how the Chinese government was reacting at that time to the pandemic. Whereas in Japan, it's on this chart, if you look at these countries, more or less at the worst end, so to speak. If you look at the Middle East and North Africa, Iran is doing badly. Saudi Arabia was doing pretty well. In Europe, it really corresponds with the numbers. If you look at Greece, they have had very low numbers. Germany, to be honest, very low numbers. France was really terrible. Spain was terrible. Italy was terrible. And the UK was terrible as well. In North America, the Canadians have been much more happy with their government than US citizens. And this will have an impact on the forthcoming election in November this year. In Sub-Saharan Africa, there are not so many surveys done. So the people in South Africa have been more happy with their performance of their government than Nigeria. I will not go into this detail because you are the expert on South Africa, and I'm definitely not the expert. If you look at Latin America, the worst performance, according to polls, was done by Brazil. You may know that the president of Brazil simply says there is no pandemic with Corona, but then he got it personally as well. Interesting for me was, if you look at the governments, and if you see that this is China, this is a non-democratic government, this is a democratic government, definitely democratic government. According to Francis Fukuyama in his latest article in Foreign Affairs from July this year, said, it's not a matter of regime time. Some democracies have performed well, but others have not, and the same is true for autocracies. The factors responsible for successful pandemic responses have been state capacity, social trust, and leadership. And I will frequently mention during my talk how China is performing. And there is an annual survey done about the trust level in many, many countries in the world, how the ordinary citizens are trusting their government. And contrary to general wisdom or what everybody thinks or sometimes reads, is that the Chinese population is very satisfied with the performance of their own government. That was the first part. I checked the, well, I still got enough time. Geopolitics and the paramount conflict of the world, and this is much different than the old Cold War the elder people are all familiar with, is the US-China conflict. And that's pretty easy to explain. We have an historical situation where you have a number one country in the world, which still is the United States, but it's declining. And you have the rise of another country, the number two to number one, and that's the rise of China. And Harvard's University, Graham Allison, he has checked such kind of historical constellations for the last 500 years. And he finds out that in 12 out of 16 cases, the two countries went at war with each other. And he called this Thucydides trap after the ancient war of Athens as rising power with Sparta as declining power. So what are the different levels or aspects of this huge conflict? It's first of all, and this is a chart from the top risk report of the Eurasia Group from 2019, but it still applies for today. It's a struggle for global leadership. From the Chinese perspective, capitalism with Chinese characteristics, it's definitely the Belt and Road Initiative. I will come to that later. It's also a question of what are the rules in the world and who is setting the rules. Then it's definitely a war where technology is playing a huge role. It's not only Huawei, semiconductors, or 5G, where the American government is trying to convince, say it friendly, all the other governments in the world, especially in the Western world, that they exclude Huawei from their 5G network. When it comes to Germany, it's pretty funny because 5G is, Huawei is already in charge for more than 50% of our technological 4G network. So Huawei is one of the largest technical suppliers already in Germany. Another critical issue is security issue. And here, especially South China Sea, I will come to that later for a moment. Anybody has heard something about North Korea recently? It totally disappeared out of the focus. And the fourth huge conflict is the trade conflict, or the trade war going on between the United States and China. And this will have an impact on a global scale already. And the COVID-19 crisis is accelerating this. So are we going to war? Which is a question, if you raise this in Europe, everybody will look at you, what are you talking about? But if you look at recent speeches in the United States, and I have a quote here from US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He did a speech in Yorba Linda, California just recently. You can see that the language he is using, I'm not reading it, you can read faster than I'm talking, is confronting China. That is the message. And they insist that the Chinese population is more or less imprisoned by the Chinese Communist Party. So the language he is using is already preparing, or looks like preparing for something else. By the way, the quote I picked is from Yondin Latho. He is the chief news editor from the South China Morning Post, which is a Hong Kong-based daily. Just recently in an article, Trump's America has become an unstoppable, out of control body. So if you are covering Asian newspapers, they are of course much closer to the South China Sea. They are now afraid that maybe purely coincidental, there will something happen which leads to a military conflict. I've mentioned Eurasia Group, and they put 5 Chinese core interests into a nice overview in their report for this year. First of all, the issue of Hong Kong. You have to keep in mind that the report was published in January 2nd this year. Hong Kong is an issue for the United States to squeeze China. The aspect of the South China Sea, which is important for the national security for China, Hong Kong, its state sovereignty. It's the Taiwan issue. It's also Xinjiang, the most western province in China. By the way, this corresponds a little bit with this picture I made in April 2014 in Yinchuan. Yinchuan is the province of Ningxia. Ningxia is one of those tiny Chinese provinces with 6 million inhabitants. And I put that picture in correspondence to Xinjiang province because have you ever heard something about struggles going on in Ningxia? Ningxia has 4,000 mosques. no problem at all, no crisis, no suppression of Muslims. The mayor at that time was Muslim, for example. And the fifth battlefield, so to speak, if you would like to say so, is technological innovation and the conflict between the US and China. As of yesterday, I like to read that quote also from the South China Morning Post. The US had started sending aircraft carriers on the first of 3 missions to the waters within a month. The People's Liberation Army responded by sending bombers in a high intensity exercise over the South China Sea, it said last week, etc., etc. So it's really obvious that something is going on in the South China Sea. And if you look at the military planes from the US flying over that area, the number has doubled from May to July. So why is this important? That's pretty simple. You can see this map, US territories and bases outside of the US. And you can see that's a couple of hundreds, 800, you don't have to count it now. So you can see the United States is having military bases all over the world. And if you look here at China and Russia, by the way, you can see it's really a cycle around. And even one, Diego Garcia, which is UK, here is not even on that map, which is important for secret actions done by the US military. You might have heard that Trump has announced he will withdraw some of his military from Germany. This is a map from The Economist just recently published where you can see all the military bases in the southern part of Germany. Stuttgart is important because all the military operations covering Africa will be organized from this headquarters as far as I know. If you look at the map, it's pretty easy that Stephen Walt from Harvard University just recently in foreign policy said that would any great power to be happy if the world's most powerful country had significant military forces arrayed nearby and had a close military alliances with many of its immediate neighbors? Well, it's easy to say no. So what is China doing or reacting during the last couple of years? Of course, they are not sitting idle for obvious reasons. And the Belt and Road Initiative is part of setting a different outline of Chinese influence in the world. At the moment, sorry for that, that's a German chart, but it's pretty easy to explain. If you see a country which is red or orange, then you can see that Chinese Marines have visited that country. Of course, that's China. Then you can see Saudi Arabia, for example, or Oman, and a few other harbors in the world where Chinese Marines have been there. At the moment, there is only one military base outside of China, that's on African soil, that's in Djibouti. And the second one now is under construction in Jask, Iran, at a geopolitical, very important part of the world, because all the oil from the Iran passes through, or from Saudi Arabia is going through this passage. And this is roughly exactly that part here where my arrow now is. But this is still under construction. So the next war, so to speak, going on is China has or will have an interest that the dollar, the importance of the dollar will be reduced. So that's one of the reasons why China is pushing since a couple of years their own currency, the yen, especially in Belt and Road nations, for example, in the Iran. So I've mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative now already for a couple of times. This is still the more or less actual map if you include just Iran here. And you can see that the central point to start with Africa from a Chinese perspective is Kenya. The second important country is South Africa. In the old days, when BRICS was still a valid political construction, South Africa was much more important. But now I would say it's Kenya and East Africa. By the way, which has historical reasons. If you remember that the Admiral Zheng He was one of the first non-African or non-Arab who has been visiting, so to speak, Africa. So the Belt and Road Initiative is a relatively new initiative. I remember that for the first time it was mentioned by Xi Jinping in a speech in, at that time it was called Astana in Kazakhstan at the university. And I also remember that in December 2015, I was a member of a small group in Hong Kong in a discussion, even with PLA generals, where nobody really has had a clue what Xi Jinping is talking about. And out of a sudden, it really developed in a global infrastructure network which will change the world definitely. So this is more on a side note. What is Facebook doing? Facebook is now trying to cover Africa in better, and they are laying undersea cables along the African coast. Okay, what is the scenario of the outcome? That's an open bet, but there are a few more things are relatively clear. First of all, under Trump, and this is a quote from Fareed Zakaria in an article, The Self-Destruction of American Power. It's really readable in Foreign Affairs, published in July, August in that issue. Under Trump, the United States has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was the first thing he did. And from engaging with Asia more generally. It is uncoupling, that's an important term, itself from its 70-year partnership with Europe, blaming especially Germany for all the sins the Germans are doing in the US. It has dealt with Latin America through the prism of either keeping immigrants out of the United States, you remember the wall issue, or winning votes in Florida. It has even managed to alienate Canadians. Any retreat, another quote from The Economist from June this year, which put what's going on into a nutshell, by America from global leadership is an opportunity for China. And if you look at 2020, I would say, and that's one of the few predictions I would like to make, that this is really the turning point where there is, even if Trump is re-elected, there is no point of return. In this program, so to speak, or the attitude Trump is having is fits the ending of the Fulbright program for Hong Kong and China. And in the South China Morning Post, it would be put into a broader perspective. This will hurt the US cultural influence. And one of the strengths of the United States still is that the United States have soft power, independent from Trump or who is running the show at the moment. And the term soft power, which was coined by Joseph Nye, by the way, is very important for the attractiveness of a country. I personally, I was beneficiary of not of the Fulbright program, but of another program from the US State Department. And I can tell you that was in January 1993. I have immensely benefited from that program, getting a lot of insight, etc., etc. Okay, Trump's policy, not only this year, but the decline started earlier, to be honest, is eroding the US soft power. And I would say that Joseph Nye's claim China won't benefit and the United States will remain preeminent, which he did in an article in Foreign Policy in April this year, will be turned out wrong. So why is this important? That's pretty simple, because these are figures from 2016, the old days, so to speak. You can see the huge amount of GDP on a global scale the US are having, and China. So the two of them, they have an impact on the rest of the world. I'm looking for South Africa. You're at that time 0.42 of the global GDP. That's not that much. So part 3, trade and businesses, globalization after 2020. In preparation for this lecture, I checked some of my books you can see behind me, and I remembered a wonderful book at that time. One of the best books on globalization at an early stage was John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge, A Future Perfect, published in 2000. And I found that quote, a well-designed national health service is often a competitive advantage in a global economy, and a well-run public education system is a necessity. That was in 2000. Unfortunately, many countries in the world have forgotten this, that both aspects are very important. Especially the first one, a well-designed national health service, is a competitive advantage. And if you look at the figures I've presented at the beginning of my talk on the COVID-19 pandemic, and if you go into more detail, which country has an excellent health service and which one doesn't have it, it really corresponds with the amount of death and in all the cases they have had. For example, Singapore has a wonderful health service system. Germany has a wonderful health system, by the way, which was always under threat from think tanks saying we should privatize more our hospitals and reduce the hospital beds, etc., etc. And lucky for us, we didn't follow these think tank advices and kept our health service on that level we have had. And that was the reason why Germany really had a great performance during the pandemic so far. So 2 points I would like to briefly to mention without going into detail. First of all, and this corresponds a little bit with the quote I've just mentioned, the problem in the world is it's too unfair to the majority of the people. We still have a huge gap in the mortality rate of children under the age of 5. You look at the lousy performance of Somalia and Iceland. Well, that's only 300,000 people, but you could name other countries. Life expectancy at birth, Japan, for example, or Sierra Leone, unfortunately another African country. Mean years of schooling, Germany in this case on top, Burkina Faso, unfortunately another African country at the bottom end. Expected years of schooling, Australia, South Sudan, and average income, Qatar, well, take another more important country, Switzerland and Central African Republic, which means the majority of the people in the world are treated unfairly and they don't have a chance to fulfill their dreams, have a better education, etc., etc. A second point I would briefly like to mention is climate change. carbon dioxide emissions per capita. The darker red a country is, the more sinners we are. South African is not doing so good. Australia, terrible, of course, burning all the coals. The US and Europe, etc., etc. So global trade, and as a case, tourism as the poster child of globalization. The old days, you remember, we have had a problem during 2008, 2009, the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy and the worldwide financial crisis. You can see that it really has had an impact, which you can see in all the economies in the world. Not so much in South Africa, but especially in the United States, in Germany, in France, not in China, but that's a different story. Still the old days, here you can see the rise of Asian in general, total merchandise trade by region, North America, which includes Mexico and the United States, slowly declining. Within that 10-year span, Asia on the rise, mostly China, China, China. And if you're looking where Africa is, it's 2. It was 4, and now it's 2%. So I would say Africa is underperforming at the moment, but as I will end on a positive note, I put the Africa chapter at the end of my talk. The problem is that Africa still has only 50% interregional trade. So most of the trade is going out of Africa, not in the sense of Karen Blixen, but in a trade sense. And the most important trade partner is the EU. I will come to that later. So what is the situation at the moment? Of course, it's too early to judge, but we do have a huge contraction of the economy worldwide. How deep it will be at the end and how long it will last is still very difficult to judge. But you can see it's really a crisis which is much deeper, much broader than we have had any crisis after the Second World War. It's also especially going downhill in Africa. These are numbers from June 2020 from the World Bank. And I put the first 3 African countries in the forecast here, and for technical reasons, these are the numbers for South Africa. It's the forecast is minus 7.1%. Let's wait till the end of the year how deep the contraction really is. I would like to exemplify a couple of things with the tourism industry, especially, and I'm covering only international tourism. You can see this is really a booming industry. There is no industry in the world where you have such a growth rate during the last 30, 40, 50 years. The figure stops at 2018, but you can see Europe still is having the lion's share of international tourism. The Americas going pretty well as well, but especially Asia Pacific is a growing region as a source for international tourism. This has to do with China. Now, during these days, sorry for this bizarre chart. We will start on these 2 figures from The Economist from July, and this one was a little bit earlier. The pandemic caused more or less all the airlines to stop their flights. So you didn't have had any international cargo excluded flights for business or tourist reason. This has an impact, for example, on the market capitalization of all the companies involved, like travel websites, airlines, airport infrastructure, for example, aircraft suppliers, plane makers, etc. I put this slide, this figure on my slide for a simple reason. Normally, if you talk about tourism, everybody is saying, well, that's a low income industry. That's not the case. Of course, you have many people in services who are not too well paid, but you also have extremely highly paid pilots, engineers, etc., etc. So it's really covering the whole range of jobs providable. And if you look at the numbers from the World Travel and Tourism Council, they said that during the last couple of years, 1 out of 4 new net jobs came from the tourism industry. I put this cover of The Economist on the upper right and called The Fall of Hong Kong, because here you really can see the impact of China on the economy of, in that case, of Hong Kong. China started with international tourism only roughly 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you have had close to 0 international trips. Last year, you have had roughly 180 million international trips. This is close to 20%, 10 to 20% of the international numbers as a whole. So if you look at Hong Kong, at that time in July 2019, the riots in Hong Kong started. And immediately the numbers of tourists from mainland China to Hong Kong went down. In January, the situation even more deteriorated with more demonstrations, and now it's close to 0. Why is it important? Pretty simple. Tourism is one of the 4 pillars of the economy of Hong Kong. It generates 3.6% of Hong Kong's GDP, which is a big number. And here you can see the statistics from May 2020, and the growth rate, so to speak, is minus 99.9%. And this is important for Hong Kong, because 80% of all visitors in the past 5 years came from mainland China. Another country everybody would like to travel to is Thailand. Same with me, by the way. Chinese tourists account for 1/4 of the 40 million visitors in Thailand last year. In January to March, the numbers already went down, of course, with Chinese visitors, because Chinese visitors didn't travel to Thailand in February and March, etc., etc. And the forecast is that this year there might be 10 million visitors in Thailand, which is only 1/4 of the visitors that I wanted normally to have. And as tourism is accounting 11% of the GDP, alone the tourism industry has a huge impact on the economy in Thailand, and no wonder the forecast for 2020 is minus 8.1%. Briefly coming to tourism in South Africa. In South Africa is one of the most fascinating tourist destinations in the world. And from my point of view, it's still underperforming. But it is a significant industry in South Africa, especially in the less developed provinces like Mpumalanga. That was the reason why I put this picture of a springbok. I made that picture last December when I've been at the University of Mpumalanga and Kruger National Park. So these provinces are even suffering more because that's their main industry, so to speak. And South Africa is only, the quote is from an article, from many articles in the Africa report from June this year. normally in September, the tourism season starts, but as far as I know, there will be no tourism to South Africa in the next few months. And as far as I know, there are already 500,000 up to 1 million jobs lost in July this year. Why I'm talking so much about tourism and Chinese tourism in particular, that's pretty easy. This is a chart from a webinar from The Economist, the intelligence unit. Chinese tourists are very shy when there are problems in their destination countries. And they account already for 9% of all departures or arrivals, but 18% of the expenditure. So Chinese tourists in general are spending much more money when they are traveling the world than any other tourists. To give you an example of the importance of other destinations, the Balearian Island in Spain, they haven't had so much corona cases. They have had 18 million British visitors last year. And this translates into 18 billion euros income for that region. So I see I have spent too much time I will skip that. So recovery. This worldwide situation is still deteriorating and not really getting better. And that's one of the reasons why the two Nobel Prize winners from last year claimed that the world now needs a COVID-19 Marshall Plan for the poor countries, especially for the African countries. So what we are facing is at the moment a huge welfare loss in all the countries of the world, and the recovery, and that's the prediction, in many countries will take 2, 3, maybe 4 years, maybe even longer. Just to say one word on prediction, Germany was predicted minus 8.4 in Q2 by The Economist midst of July. The actual figure 14 days later is 10.1. So what we are having in the future, a couple of points I would like to make. The world figured out that the global economy is highly dependent on China, because China's share of global trade in some industries is more than 50%, especially telecommunications equipment was close to 60% in 2018. So we will have in the near future, if the economy is starting again, supply chains will be reorganized, more different countries, more areas in the world, closer to home. Then healthcare spending in general will be increasing, especially when it comes to medical equipment, drugs, etc. To give you one example, antibiotics production is these days more or less 100% dependent on India and China. And the only company who still there's only one company to be more precise, who is still producing antibiotics in Europe is one in Austria. What we cannot have a clear picture how the consumer behavior might be different in the future. And many of us have faced the chance to work from home. So remote working will be not the solution, but for more office people, it will be a mixture between working from home and in the office. And geography matters again. We need all good neighbors, and that's an argument I will come to Africa and the EU in 1.5 minutes. I will skip that. That's the old economy. Africa's weakness is still infrastructure. China is the one who is doing the most in Africa, building infrastructure. If you look at the EU countries, 5%, and the US only 1.7%. That's a study done by Deloitte. I will skip that. So there are three scenarios in for Africa. First one, now I'm speeding up, is security. This is a big problem, violence involving jihadist groups, especially when they started just recently that more civilians are the victims. These are the latest figure from, by the way, a good website, the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. And here you can see the countries where all the terrorist attacks are taking place. Unfortunately for me, because my wife and I, we will relocate to Kenya in fall this year. Kenya is one of the countries suffering from Al-Shabaab. Okay, Africa will be the geopolitical battlefield of the US-China conflict. And one aspect is China and Africa, and the arguments, it's mostly not true what you can read in newspapers, because if you look at academia, you have many studies who really trying to figure out in more detail what's right and what it's wrong. And as a reference to Brian, and I know Brian is watching it, I've put this wonderful book he did with Cobus Jonga, China's Impact on the African Renaissance, where I personally learned a lot. And I would recommend the China-Africa Research Initiative from Johns Hopkins. And just recently they published 1 month ago a paper on China's role on the debt structure of African countries, and the point they made was their debt problem are not made in China. So, but the US-China tensions also create opportunities Africa must seize. I will skip this because this is more or less redundant. Can skip this one. The EU is now developing a better and different strategy for more engagement in Africa. I put a picture of the German development minister, Gerd Müller, on that slide because his nickname is, he is the Africa minister. You can see these are the figures of import, exports, and trade balance between the EU and Africa till last year. I would say this is not really a success story. We could do much more together, because the EU still is the most important trading partner for all African countries. And our politicians, in the sense of Europe, now have recognized that Africa really counts. And I put that quote on my slide from Chancellor Merkel when she was addressing the European Parliament in July this year, where she said we have to intensify for the future at an EU-Africa summit, which unfortunately will be postponed. And I think I've two more things. Let the sun shine in. Africa has plenty of sunshine. So Africa could use this for the better of the world in producing much more solar power. I will not make a comment on Eskom and their performance. The general weakness besides infrastructure is that Africa has too less of intra-African trade, and the regional value chains are not as good as they should be. To exemplify this with 2 points. First, with the cotton industry, Africa is producing cotton fibers, yarn, maybe fabrics, but not apparel or fashion industry, where this is where the money is coming from. And to end on a sweet note, chocolate, it's really a shame that Africa is producing 75% of the world production of chocolate beans, but not good chocolate. And I'm missing this pretty much. Okay, well, that's it. Thank you for your attention. And I will hand over to Professor Arnolds. Olian.
Good day. We have a little bit of a technical problem. Good afternoon, all our attendees and our panelists. So I will take over until Professor Arnolds is able to reconnect with us at this stage. Attendees, I would like to invite you at this stage to please place any questions that you have in the chat box on your Zoom panel, and we will then include you in the conversation with Professor Gert this afternoon. So in looking through and listening to the presentation today, thank you so much, Professor, for that input. It has been very insightful. I won't talk about the chocolate, as that has negative impacts on women at most times in their lives. I will, however, refer to the questions that we have. So we have one particular question that I have noted from a gentleman, sorry, I just want to get there, from Leon Liederman, who is the CEO of GrowCom. And Leon poses the question to you. He's written a little bit of text to give us context. So I will note the context to our attendees, and then I will pose the question. So Leon states that he has specifically looked at and predicted COVID-19 and well, he's stating that COVID-19 and the death of George Floyd saved the world from a third world war. He claims that he's predicted this in 2010. Leon, I hope I'm doing your question justice. In one of his training articles in 2015. And Leon then predicted a third world war, not between nations, but within nations, where the poor and the rich would be up against each other. And Leon's question to you, Prof. Gert, is, do you think that his assumptions was pie in the sky back then in 2010?
I think the Black Lives Matter issue is longing for ages in the United States. I mean, this is a familiar turf, so to speak, for me. And in general, it's not only a question of how in the US Black people have a fair chance for a decent life. It's also a question of xenophobia in the US, which you are having. That was one of the reasons why I put the slide with the Kung Flu aspect in it. At the moment, the discussion is dominated by the Black Lives Matter issue. That's correct. But to be honest, I mean, this is really a shame what's going on in the US. But this is a problem mostly of the US, that you have a part of the population where the conditions of the lives is really going downhill. You can see this at the life expectancy, that especially Black male have a 10-year, as far as I know, a 10-year lower life expectancy rate than white men in the same nation.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a second question from Leon as well, and here he's wanting to know if his, I will call it his assumption, is that will the dominance of China, despite their internal issues, face headwinds from the developing countries, such as South Africa and like countries?
I'm not quite sure if I really got the question right. China at the moment is facing headwinds, of course, but not only from South Africa, from many countries in the world. And this has to do with the perception of China as a good or as a bad hegemon. The US in many countries, because of their soft power, was considered as, even if they have had a president which everybody was despising outside of the US, we still watched American movies, American literature, American pop songs, and wanted to study in the United States, or if we are suffering in our home country, we wanted to migrate to the United States as a harbor for freedom, so to speak. And this is definitely not the case at the moment with China. Funny thing is, well, it's not so funny. When I've had a meeting with the Chinese ambassador to Germany last April to present to him a new study I did on German-Chinese relationship, he asked me, do you have any advice for us how we could behave so the perception is more of a friendly nation? And well, that's a difficult question and strange situation for me to answer. So I was scratching my head and said, oh, how can I still be diplomatic? And I say, relax. They can't be more relaxed. Their trajectory is going upwards. They can be much more relaxed in their behavior. For example, when it comes to Africa, even if the debt load of many countries is not as big as it is from a Chinese perspective, it's insignificant. So say to the Kenyan government or whatever government, you can be relaxed, 50% we write off and the other 50% are zero interest. So.
Thank you. I see Professor Arnold.
But at the end of the day, as I've mentioned, geography matters. The South Asian countries, they will side with China and not with the US, because their economy depends on China. That's one aspect. And you have to keep in mind that all the economies in Southeast Asia are run by ethnical Chinese people. If it's the Philippines, if it's Thailand, if it's Indonesia, if it's Malaysia, it's all ethnical Chinese. So the Chinese diaspora is a very important asset, so to speak, for China, as it is, by the way, for India with the Indian community outside of India.
Thank you for that input. I will now hand over to Professor Arnold, who has joined us once again. Thank you, Professor Arnold.
I briefly see you. Unfortunately, I have technical problems as well, because everything disappeared with the exception of 4 small pictures on my screen. But anyway.
Good, no, thank you. My sincere apologies for having lost my connection there. I really enjoyed your presentation, Gert. Thank you very much for the update information, all your slides being 2020. So I can see you have been keeping up to date with all the developments, a true international management lecturer. I don't know whether Leanne has actually read that question to you of one of the participants. Maybe I should do it. I don't know what Leanne has done, because I lost about 10 minutes now of the last session. But let me read it and you can tell me. I was
rushing through the last 10 minutes in any case, so nobody got anything from it.
Okay, but I've got one here for you, Gert, and that is this participant asked that while we can see maybe a war developing, as you say, between China and the USA and so on, the ramifications of that for the global situation. This participant also said we can also expect war within countries. Yeah. War within countries because of, you have got that one. Thank you, that I've covered. I was just thinking from my side also, Gert, is what is the role still of BRICS in this whole situation? If we expect also some problems from developing countries, what is the role of BRICS still in this situation?
I didn't get off the role of
BRICS, the BRICS formation.
You mean you mean
China, Brazil, Africa, and so on? Yes.
At the moment, I don't see a significant role, to be honest. because China doesn't need it anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
put it simple. China doesn't
Yes.
need it anymore. Russia is a problematic country because it's the strength of Russia is military.
Yes.
And oil. Brazil is terrible in a terrible situation, and India is a competitor of China these
Yes.
days. So they will. This will be, by the way, the next conflict because India will be on the rise. I mean, I will be dead when it comes to that conflict, but that's a different story. But it takes, I would say, 20 to 30 years. But of course, if you have a country of the size of India, 1.4 million, which is as much as China these days. I mean, Indians are bright. Look at Silicon Valley. Yeah. So
absolutely.
right.
Yes.
So that their performance will be better and better and better over time. And well, economy is important. And geography is important. So you will have a conflict there as well.
Yes, yes. No, thank you, Gert. I don't know whether we can, because we are already 5 minutes past the time, and we don't want to go too far over the time.
Yeah.
Can we just ask our participants to remind them that they can still send their questions to us on the chat room, and then we will then type those questions and give it to you, and then you will respond to that, and we'll give it back to them. You know, we will type your answers to participants and so on.
That's a good idea. And I could also, because sorry for the last 15 where I really rushed through, but I can provide you with my presentation, and all the material is in my notes. There you will find all the resources, etc. I've been quoting or relying on, and maybe you can organize it that participants can download it.
Yeah.
Because it's 63 megabytes, so it's,
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Kurt, for a very informative presentation. We really enjoyed it, and I think we learned a lot from you. Especially, you know, what is going on in actually a good question is also what happens to globalization in this in the COVID-19 situation and so on, whether we will see more, you know, an inward look in countries, or will that also impact on, but I wanted to ask you all these questions, but now we don't have time, Gert, and I lost my 10 minutes.
I will come to PE in February if there are flights.
But I will send you my questions also, and then we can respond to the participants. Kurt, thank you very much again. We will definitely invite you more to our lectures. In any case, we are starting our lecture early next year on international business, international management, and surely you will be a guest speaker again in those sessions as well. So let me then make a final announcement, Gert. There is our next webinar is on leadership, and I don't have it here now in front of me. Leanne, I think I missed that as well. But there is our next webinar will be on leadership, and Dr. Naidu is going to speak to us about leadership in the COVID-19 situation. You know, I think you also mentioned that state capacity, social trust, and leadership are the critical success factors. And our next webinar will definitely be the role of leadership in how to address this rebound of the economy and so on, and businesses. Kurt, thank you very much. I'm not going to waste further of your time. We will definitely see you in the MBA lectures also going forward.
Okay. Thank you, Cecil. Thank you. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank you very much, Gert. Go well, eh? And thank you very much for the team, Leanne and Terence. Thank you very much for organizing our webinar. Okay. Bye-bye. Keep well, colleagues.
Bye-bye. See you. Bye-bye. Thank you all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.